This is the Happy Families Podcast. Hello, my name is Dr. Justin Coulson. It's so good of you to join me for today's conversation. This is one that I've been so excited about for a long, long time. Today's guest has been linked to one of the most famous psychological experiments ever done, or certainly in the last several decades. This has become an absolute classic. I'll tell you more about it in just a sec, but let me introduce my guest. Dr. Ethan Kross is a professor in the psychology department at I'll just say it, the prestigious Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. Ethan specializes in the study of self-control, and he was mentored in graduate school by Walter Mischel, who famously studied delayed gratification with what's become known as the marshmallow experiment. Ethan runs the University of Michigan Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory, and he has won a number of awards over the course of his career, as well as being featured in publications including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, and USA Today. And I began by asking Ethan about his work and his family life.
Well, I run a lab called the University of Michigan Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory, and basically we do lots of experiments to try to figure out how self-control works in children and adults. And when I use the term self-control, I mean, how can people align their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors with their goals? So it's really broad. It's really like, if you want to act or think or feel a particular way in this world, how can you do that? What are the psychological tools that allow you to fulfill those goals? And so that takes us down a lot of exciting paths that I'm sure we'll talk about today. And when I'm not working in the lab with my students and colleagues, I'm both working and relaxing at home. They a lot of work at home too. I'm married to a woman named Laura, and I've got two daughters, Maya and Danny, age 11 and 6, who are a lot of fun and the inspiration for lots of self-control experiments.
Yeah, I bet. Do you ever experiment on them? Have you done the marshmallow experiment with your two daughters?
I have. In fact, I have a funny story about the marshmallow experiment with my oldest daughter, Maya. So my advisor in graduate school was actually the Marshmallow Man, Walter Mischel.
Oh, so now before you tell me about Maya, for people who are not familiar with Walter Mischel and the marshmallow experiment, because that was going to be my next question anyway.
Okay.
When I was cyberstalking, I was like, no way. Ethan Kross was supervised by one of the modern legends of psychology. He did this marshmallow experiment that so many people have heard of, and maybe even have seen in a recent resurgence of it on TikTok in the last few months through the isolation stage. What did he do, and then what did you do with Maya as a result of that?
Sure. So the marshmallow test, in a nutshell, it's a paradigm for studying self-control in the lab under controlled conditions. And what you do is you bring a kid into the lab, and then you give them a choice. You say, you can have one treat now, and we call it the marshmallow test, but in fact, we use whatever treats the kids like. So for some kids, it's raisins, other kids, it's pretzels. And
you show me one child that's going to pick a raisin over a marshmallow. I mean, really.
There are some. We could talk about the question marks that surround their match. I'm just joking. Some kids like fruit. Go figure. So you give them a choice: one marshmallow now, or if you wait until I come back, I have to leave the room for a little bit, but if you can just sit tight and wait, then you can have 2 marshmallows. But the only way you can have 2 is if you wait until I come back. And the experimenter doesn't tell the child how long it's going to take for them to come back. So there's uncertainty, which we know everyone who's living through COVID-19 right now, uncertainty can drive emotional responses. And so this for children is a really difficult choice, right? Because all the kids, like Walter and the experimenters who are running these studies, they make sure that everyone wants the 2 marshmallows.
And they're normally only around age 4, maybe 5 or 6 at the most, right? So it's not like self-regulation, self-control, which is what we're talking about, and teaching this to kids. It's not like this is intrinsic to them at this point. Self-control is hard. They go from zero to 100 emotionally in seconds, don't they?
Some kids do and other kids don't. And so that's one of the really interesting findings surrounding this this line of work. So so everyone wants the 2 marshmallows, but they have this dilemma. They're looking at this delectable treat, right? They're drooling over it. So what do? So it turns out in one line of studies, they find that the kids who were able to wait longer, their delay of gratification ability predicts lots of important life outcomes later on in life. So how well they do in school, how adjusted they are in their relationships and their health. And the idea is that what this task is tapping into is this basic competency, this ability to manage our emotions. The other thing that this line of research tells us, though, is Walter did lots of experiments to figure out, well, how can you direct kids to think differently about what they're waiting for, the 2 marshmallows versus 1? What are the different psychological tricks that you can use, so to speak, to manage your emotions effectively? And so they did lots of experiments and developed lots of insights that informed us now many decades later about what are the tools that people possess that we can use to control ourselves. So that's the marshmallow test in a nutshell. And to bring it back to my family, the fun anecdote is I, of course, have been waiting like a decade since I started working with Walter to have a kid who I could do this task with. And so I dutifully set up the task and all the parameters and make sure I'm doing it by the book. And then I sit Maya down and I describe it and I say, okay. And before I leave, she goes, Daddy, I want 1 marshmallow now and I want both later. And so it's a clear violation of the protocol. And so because I know Walter, or passed away recently, but I knew him, I picked up the phone and I called Walter and I said, Walter, have you ever heard of a child doing this in all the years that you've been doing this research? And he pauses and then very sternly he says, Ethan, it's not too soon to start therapy. As an indicator of what he of course was joking, but the message was delivered well. And so
you're going to have a long, hard life with a negotiator. That's what he's right. Really saying. Get ready, buckle in.
Basically, that's right. So we maybe we'll get into it later. Maya has proven to be quite adept at negotiations in the 6 years since we've done that task. So.
Now, before I ask the next question, I think it's really important to highlight that as a parenting expert or as a psychology researcher, my suggestion is you probably wouldn't be encouraging parents to do the marshmallow test at home with their children as a diagnostic tool to determine how self-controlled they'll be throughout their life. Their destiny is not in their decision around the marshmallow.
Absolutely not.
I mean, it's a fun experiment.
It's a fun experiment. And, the way that the context in which I used it with my kids was to introduce them to a scientific experiment and then to talk about what we've learned. And one of the things that we've learned, which often gets lost in the translation of this work when people talk about it with the world, is that one of the things we know is that you can change your self-control. One of my pet peeves is when I hear people saying, you have no self-control. That's absolutely not true. Everyone possesses self-control to some extent. Some of us are better at exerting it in some contexts as opposed to others. I may be really good at exerting self-control, regulating myself when I'm working on a problem at work, but maybe I have a little bit more difficulties when I'm coaching soccer. That's not true. I'm pretty good there too. But I have my weaknesses. They're associated with the pantry post 10 p.m. at night when I crave some foods.
Bit of ice cream.
So we all have our Achilles heel when it comes to self-control, but what we know is that there are different tools we can use to improve our self-control. And these different things we can do, they're teachable, their strategies are often easy to implement. And so I talk to my kids about the different ways that they can manage the temptation when it exists. And so absolutely not. You wouldn't want people to think that scores on that test are their destiny by any means.
Yeah, and I've done it at home with my kids as well, purely to have the conversation about self-control and how it works. In fact, you've taken me exactly to where I wanted to go next, and that was just to talk about how we can teach our children self-control. And what I'm especially interested in is how does it affect children who are not developing along the typical pathways, kids that have got ADHD, kids that have got autism. What can your self-control research teach us in terms of helping those more narrow, rigid thinking children to manage themselves well?
one disclaimer is we haven't looked at several of those populations, and there's always this tension between wanting to generalize from the studies we've done as far as we can. And without having looked at ADHD and autism in particular, it's hard to make that leap because we're dealing with, in some cases, very different kinds of populations with their own unique characteristics. Now, what we do know, we can say something though about populations of children who experience difficulty regulating themselves in general. So not clinical populations, but groups that are just more impulsive, more prone to anger, more prone to experiencing temptation. By and large, what we see is that the more intense the emotional response, the more effective the different self-controls tend to be. So the idea there is, look, if you're dealing with a little bit of emotion, there's not a whole lot of room for these tools to help you feel better or help you rein it in. But as the amplitude of the emotions go up, the more intense it is, the more room there is to help bring you down. And so in some of those Batman effect studies, for example, we've seen that the kids who benefit the most from that technique are the ones who have the most difficulty regulating themselves in general. They're the ones who are benefiting. And so there are lots of open questions about whether that'll extend to autistic and other populations, but we do have some inklings that it might. So there are a boatload of different strategies that people can use to exert self-control, both children and adults. And to be concrete about what I mean by that, we know, for example, that when people are tempted to act in particular ways or when they're trying to control their emotions, diverting their attention can be really powerful, right? As a short-term fix. So you might want to have a person, if something is bothering us or tempting us, let's focus on something else. And for young children in particular, diverting attention can be a powerful tool. If they're looking at a treat, for example, in the marshmallow studies, like one of the best ways to get kids to wait longer was to put a little box on top of the marshmallow so the kids couldn't see it, or to have the child think about other things, think fun thoughts about being on the playground with mommy pushing me on the swing. So diverting our attention away from the thing that's tempting or bothering us can be one kind of tool. Another kind of tool deals with the ability of the mind to change the way we think about things. So we did a study several years ago. It was a brain imaging experiment in which we were trying to look at how people can reduce craving responses to things like pizza or drugs, right? We see these temptations, we desperately want them. And so in one condition, we had people just look at an image of a delicious looking piece of pizza. And in another condition, we had them imagine that a cockroach had just crawled across the pizza. And so that's just an example of the power of the mind to transform the way we think about things. And how we change the way we think can change the way we feel. That is the basis of cognitive therapy and cognitive interventions to change our mood.
So in a nutshell, what we want to do with our children is we want to either divert their attention so they're not even thinking about it, or make it invisible, like literally pick it up and move it, or pick your child up and move your child. And this will obviously work a lot easier with younger children, but you can still make stuff invisible. They usually look at you and whinge and say, oh, I can't believe you're taking that away. But technically that's not self-control, that's parent control. Nevertheless, it will reduce the challenge that you're facing.
Well, I think the way you're describing it, right, is the parent is being the agent of control. Like
right.
It's this parent control. But what we also can do, and one of the things we're exploring now, is teaching kids to do this on their own. And so one of the striking, if you look back at some of those early marshmallow studies, what you see is that some kids spontaneously do this. Some kids close their, you can't see me now, your listeners can't see me, but I'm mimicking what they do. Some kids put their hand over their eyes. One girl, had really long hair and she flipped it so she couldn't see the marshmallow in front of her. Another kid told himself a story, an elaborate story with imaginary friends. And so these are all different tools that kids are doing on their own. And so as parents, we possess the ability to essentially give kids the tools by distracting them or prompting them to think differently. Hey, that person's bothering you at the schoolyard, but let's look at the big picture, Maya or Danny. You know what? They have lots of friends. You don't have to talk with that person. So we could shift their perspective. But what we can also do is we can teach children to do this on their own.
If you were to rattle off, let's say 3 self-control tips, the top 3 that come to mind for children who are somewhere around 4, 5, 6, 7 years of age, those elementary school, those early primary school years, what kind of tips would you give parents if they want to help their kids to develop the self-control to not eat the marshmallow or the pretzel or the raisin?
Right.
Where do they go?
Well, I think one is attention. So teaching them how to divert their attention away from whatever's tempting them and give themselves something to focus on is even more powerful. So really get them to focus in on something that's equally engaging, but not the thing that's tempting them. So if you don't want them to watch TV, give them a really fun puzzle to work on or something like that, or problem to work on. Another thing is changing the way they think about something. So if they're looking at the candy and they really want to eat it, ask them to imagine, imagine that I guess kids aren't tempted by bread. What is it? Candy, basically, mostly, right? I mean, imagine that someone stepped on it, or those kinds of transformations can be powerful, right? So don't think about it as a marshmallow. Think about it as a puffy cloud, right? So play with it in your head. And importantly, when you play with it, don't think about the things that are most, oh my God, I'm going to think about how it's going to taste. If you've talked to your child about the negative health implications of eating too much candy, or negative health implications for a child, like tummy aches, right? Not feeling good after, have them think about that. So, think about the fact that too many marshmallows can make you not so healthy, and that's not a good thing. You have to go to the doctor and so forth and so on. A third strategy you can use, to give you the last one, is you can try something called what we've called the Batman effect. So have a child find their favorite superhero and ask. So superheroes are generally really good at exercising restraint, right? And being able to do good things in the world. And so in some studies, what a colleague of mine, Stephanie Carlson, has found is that having children imagine they're a superhero and use their name. Imagine you're Batman and say, what would Batman do right now? Would Batman be able to not eat the marshmallow? Or Dora the Explorer? What would Dora do? That can be really powerful. It transports them into this other role, which gives them some distance from the temptation and also this superpower to restrain it. And so that's been a fun strategy that kids have been able to benefit from in some experiments.
I love the Batman effect. And what I really love about that piece of research is, well, first of all, we're looking at how people who speak to themselves in that sort of alter ego way, what would Batman do? What would Wonder Woman do? What would Bob the Builder do? Versus, come on, Ethan, you've got this, versus I know what I would do. These 3 different conditions. And you found in this study that kids persevered longer. They had more motivation. They had a greater level of self-control and tenacity. So I've been talking to adults about that and saying, when you're up against something where you don't want to exert the kind of control that's necessary, or where you're struggling, or you don't want to persevere, or you're ready to explode at your children and you just need to regulate your emotions, don't necessarily think about what Batman would do, but think about who your inner mental mentor might be. Think of Ethan Kross, or many people, unfortunately for me, will say that I just think about what you would do or what I would do if you were watching me. I know that ancient and modern traditions have encouraged that. So there's the Christian tradition of wearing the WWJD bracelet. What would Jesus do? And I think that's a kind of a self-control strategy, really, isn't it? It's a psychological or self-distancing strategy.
Absolutely. This idea of distance, really what it boils down to is it's almost like giving yourself a time out in the moment. So it's this ability, when we experience strong emotions, they often narrow our attention in on exactly what it is that's driving those responses. And that zooming in can make it really difficult to take the broader picture into account. If I am too intolerant with my children, how might that affect them long term? So this ability to just hit stop for a moment and zoom out can be really powerful. And there's lots of research which shows that. And in fact, this is a project that we've been working on for the past 5 years. It's called the Toolbox Project. For the past 10 years or so, I've been teaching a class here, maybe little bit less than 10 years, called The Science of Self-Control to University of Michigan undergrads. And it's essentially science's greatest hits when it comes to what we've learned over the past 50 years about how to control our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors. And it's always a really fun class to teach. The students love the material, they're engaged. And the way it works is every week, students come in, they read stuff, and I pepper them with questions. And then the final day, we reverse the roles. They come in with questions for me. It's their last day. Here's what's on my mind now that I've gone through the whole literature, I've digested it, and so forth. And about 5 years ago, this one girl named Ariel, she raised her hand like really defiantly as soon as the class started, to wanting to be called on. And so I called on her and she says, "Why are we learning about this now?" And I go, "Well, what do you mean?" She goes, "Well, we've gone over all of these different strategies that exist, dozens of strategies that can help us be happier, healthier, get better jobs, and so forth. Why didn't anyone teach us about this earlier on in life when it could have helped us, like when we were kids or adolescents?" And so the first thing I said was, "Fear not, life is not over. You will still have opportunities to use these strategies once you leave college." But then I did something. I don't want to say it was slightly cowardly. I did what many politicians do when they don't have a good answer to a question. I deflected and I threw it back to the class and I said, "Well, what do other people think? Why haven't you learned about this yet?" And the reason I did that was because I didn't have a good answer to that question. And so it got me thinking a lot about, why aren't we teaching kids about what we know about how the mind works when it comes to self-control? We teach children about how the digestive system works. We teach them about geometry. We teach them about social studies. These are just concepts. These are topics that we think are important. And so they're in the kind of canon of what we expose them to in school. Well, the mind seems kind of important, and we've learned about it. So why aren't we also teaching them about this? And so fast forward 5 years, what we've been doing is a group of scientists like myself have paired up with educational experts, curriculum designers, to essentially take the science of self-control. What do we know about the different tools that exist? And we've translated that into a curriculum for middle and high school kids, so a little bit older than the ages that you were asking about. But the idea was that this was a good place to start. And so we took the science, which can be filled with complicated terms that scientists love to use, but we've made it simple and with engaging exercises. And what we're doing now is we are looking at, well, what are the implications of teaching children about these strategies? In some of our early studies, we know we have data to show that that the kids who go through this curriculum, they do in fact learn the material, right? So you do a test at the beginning and at the end of the curriculum, their knowledge of the science of self-control increases. And what we're getting ready to do with about 10,000 students next year is we're going to test to see what effect does learning about these strategies have on these students' ability to regulate themselves down the road in life. And the hypothesis, the prediction, is that knowing about these strategies should provide these kids with resources that they could draw upon when they need them. In the same way that knowing how to compute a percentage allows us to determine the tip when we go to a restaurant, the idea is that when a kid is angry or tempted, if they're motivated to control those urges or emotions, they should have a knowledge base to fall back on in those instances.
Earlier, you defined self-control. I'd like to now define emotional regulation, but I'm not sure that there's going to be an enormous difference in what you said previously. That idea of harnessing your faculties and characteristics and directing them towards a goal effectively was my summary of your definition. Would you be switching that up at all for emotional regulation?
I don't. And a disclaimer, for all of the people listening, is that scientists are really good at coming up with different terms that differ in ever so slight ways, and that can be useful when we do experiments. But I think the self includes emotions, it includes behaviors, and it includes thoughts and cognitions. And so when you're talking about controlling the self-control, to me, it's the whole kit and caboodle. So I use the broadest definition of self-control. It's aligning thoughts, feelings, and behaviors with goals. Now that doesn't mean that self-control is always a good thing, because it means that if you have bad goals, right, the better you are at self-control means that you can do bad things, right? So, for example, let's say I have the goal of committing a crime, right, which might be very challenging for me to emotionally. It might be hard to hurt someone else. If I have good self-control, that might help me do that. So self-control in my world is not always good, right?
And our kids aren't necessarily planning on committing any grievous crimes,
we hope not.
Ruling the world.
Not.
No,
that's right. And so in all of our studies, we're giving them goals that are healthy goals.
Of course,
and I think that's in most of cases that's where self-control is being harnessed towards.
I'm fascinated though by this idea that self-control can sometimes be a bad thing, and it's not necessarily just in pursuit of negative goals. Sometimes that self-control can also become counterproductive when our children become so rigid and so focused, and we do as adults as well. We become so focused on something that is good and worthy and useful, but it's actually going to come at such an extraordinary cost, and our life gets out of balance. You know, there's all this talk, Angela Duckworth, who I know you've worked with, her work around being gritty and persevering through tough times. Paul Tough wrote a book called How Children Succeed. It was all about teaching kids grit, making sure that they do the hard yards. And there's obviously a very strong argument for having that gritty determination and perseverance, having the self-control. Mm-hmm. But there's also a pretty strong argument about having the wisdom to know when to step back and just let go. Can you talk a little bit about why self-control isn't always the most important thing, or isn't always going to be functional and optimal for our children or for ourselves?
So many things are interesting about what you said. I mean, this idea of wisdom as stepping back, right, is another illustration of the value of distance, this ability to step back and take stock of what you're going through and then decide how to behave. I think your question speaks to this issue of that human beings are complicated. We are not driven to achieve one goal. We live in a world filled with multiple goals, right? So goals to succeed at work, but also to succeed in our personal lives. And those goals don't always conflict, as many people know who are trudging away at work at 8 p.m. when they might want to be home with their family. And so there are trade-offs that we are constantly trying to maintain, take stock of and balance and so forth. And it gets complicated. So, although most of our experiments focus on one goal, that's not the world in which we live. And I think people who are better able to balance all of the different goals that are on their plates and manage them accordingly are more likely to be in a position to be living the kind of life they ultimately want.
Who are these perfect people? Where are they? How do we study them?
They're in Australia.
Of course, yeah.
So I think this is unfortunately where a lot of the science stops right now, because most of the work we do thus far has been studying specific goals under tightly controlled conditions. And the reason for that is it's much harder conceptually and practically to do experiments when there are 17 goals that are all conflicting. So I wish I could tell you who these people are. There are likely exemplars that we could find and then try to study in the same way that we sometimes, one approach to science is finding people who are really good at something, the Michael Jordans of their industries, and then trying to figure out what makes them tick, and then you run experiments on them. But in my mind, we haven't yet done that on the exemplars of self-control.
I think that it's a really interesting conversation, though, and I know we're kind of going off script a little bit here, but to me, this idea that some parents will take a conversation about self-control and say, okay, well, I want my child to get into this university course or have this opportunity in life, or just you you've got to learn self-control because the Dunedin study showed that children who learn self-control do better at school and they're less likely to end up in prison and they're going to have more successful marriages. This was this 30 plus year study of how self-control is associated with all these positive outcomes. So we've got to teach you self-control, and all of a sudden life becomes too controlled. Whether it's pursuing academics or whether it's pursuing the extracurricular things like piano or ballet or whatever that thing is that our children are doing outside, becoming an Olympian, swimmer, whatever it might be.
Well, I think a big part of that equation has to do with, number one, what you as a parent and the child value, right? Because our goals, right? Like, so what are the goals that we have and which are most important to us? There are going to be people out there who, for them, the most important thing is getting into that desired college or getting that job. And if that's the case, you can make an argument that helping that child fulfill that goal is really important. But let's say people have multiple goals like that are important to them, not just getting into the best school, but also having great relationships and enjoying the moment. Well, that would suggest a different course of action. I mean, look, I study this stuff. I'm a presumed expert on this topic, and I'd be lying if I told you that my wife and I are constantly doing a kind of self and family evaluation of our kids, their goals, our goals, and how we can give them the best possibility of living a happy life. Like we want them to be successful. More than that, we want them to be happy. And, I think we are stumbling our way through, like many parents, with forward progress. Of course, if we invite Maya and Danny on the podcast, they might say something different. The first step is being mindful of this, simply being aware that life isn't driven much of the time by one goal, but by many, is an important insight that can be useful for helping parents think about how they want to structure their kids' activities and lives, given these multiple goals that they may have for their kids and that their kids may have for themselves.
Ethan, I appreciate the vulnerability and you, I guess, owning up to the fact that you're kind of making it up as you go along, even if you've got the professorship in psychology, because I feel the same way. I've written 6 books. I've got the PhD in positive psychology. I've run a bajillion seminars on this stuff. And there are days where I look at my wife and say, I don't have a clue how we're supposed to manage. Well, you tell me. And she'll look at me and say, well, you're the expert. You tell me. I'm like, I don't know. Anyway, let's move towards a conclusion. There's a couple of other questions that I want to ask you before we get to my 5 questions that always wrap up every podcast. Something that strikes me as vitally important is that emotions are contagious. Kids catch their parents cranky. They catch our chaos. They catch our crazy, but they also catch our calm. The same strategies that we've discussed for younger children, I'm sure that they work for adults as well, for parents, but I'm curious if there's anything else that you would add here. How else can parents stay calm and appropriately regulated? What strategies would you share for parents who are just over it some afternoons or evenings or mornings?
Well, let me tell you about the strategies that some of my favorites that I rely on, because there's a boatload of strategies. There are at least 2 dozen out there that have science behind it. We don't have time to get into them all. But let me tell you what I do. One thing I do is I will rely on that linguistic distancing. So when I'm in the heat of the moment, I'm anxious or I'm angry, I will use my name silently to think about what I'm going through. Ethan,
the kids are like, Dad, why are you talking to yourself in the in first person? What's going on here?
Yeah, definitely. You definitely want to do that silently. That's an important caveat. And that's helpful. Another thing I'll do is something that we call temporal distancing, jargon again. Think of it as mental time travel. This can be a very powerful tool. I'll imagine about how am I going to feel about this thing, not right now, but a week from now or a month from now or a year from now. As you age, one of the things I think many people learn is that many times time does heal, right? Our emotions go up, but inevitably they do come down, right? Our own personal news cycle is constantly running, just like it is out there in the media. New things come in to our lives, right? And our emotions subside. So I'll remind myself about about the fact that, you know what, I'll probably feel fine about this argument at work a week later. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll take a walk out in nature. There's some gorgeous data showing how simple exposures to green space can be remarkably powerful for calming us down and restoring the psychological resources that we often need to remain in control. And so that's my trio of strategies that I rely on.
Ethan, so many questions that I want to ask you, but time's going to get the better of us. So I'm going to completely switch gears for one final question. And this relates to your work that you've done around social media and well-being. We alluded earlier that we might get to this, and I really want to bring this up. So recently I spoke with Sarah Coyne at Brigham Young University, had a fascinating conversation with her around what she's been discovering in her research to do with the lack of control that both parents and children often feel in relation to their media being consumed. But also she highlighted something that Andy Chabulski at Oxford has highlighted, and that is that there doesn't seem to be any tremendous well-being downsides from reasonable amounts of device and technology usage. What I'd love to know is what does your research say about social media and well-being, and in particular, what does it say for young people, and how does this all weave back into the self-control conversation?
Easy question. This is I've been doing research in this space for about 10 years, and it's been really interesting to see it evolve. It is very contentious right now. Number one, I think we need to not talk about social media or digital screen time as this monolithic activity, right? That's either good or bad. There are countless ways that people can use social media. And if you break down different ways of using it, what you see is just like in everyday life, there are helpful versus harmful ways of interacting with other people. The same is true of social media. And so a lot of the things that we do on social media can be good for us, help build social capital and social connections. A lot of the things can be totally benign, have no implications on how we feel. And yet there can be other ways that we interact with social media that tank our emotions. For example, think about things like cyberbullying and trolling, which are really quite significant phenomena that have a ton of data behind them, right? The consequences of being cyberbullied can be extreme. The kinds of FOMO experiences and envy that we experience when we look at people's curated lives online. So there are many different ways that we can act with the technology. And I think you can ask questions about, well, does time on screen lead people to feel good or bad? And I think Sarah is right that on the whole, that data show overall usage, small negative effect on well-being, but it's a really small effect. But if you break things down into different ways of using the technology, what you find is that there are healthy and harmful ways of using it. And I think the challenge for parents is to figure out what those are so that they can teach their kids how to navigate social media optimally in the same way that we spend much of our parenting life teaching our children how to navigate the offline world optimally. The same is true, I would argue, for social media.
Yeah, so we've got the way I talk to parents about this is I'll describe 3 C's. There's connection, there's consumption, there's creation when we're online. And my read of it, and certainly your conversation just now underscores and reemphasizes this, is that when we're using it for consumption or for other negative purposes, which are certainly not effective for connection or creation, we can actually end up with the strong downside. But if we're using it for connection, we're using it for creation, we're probably going to have positive experiences online. And then it just comes down to regulation. Am I able to get off so that I can get enough sleep? Am I able to get off so that there's no impact on my physical well-being? I can still go and be a human. It sounds so sensible when you say it like that, Ethan.
Yeah. No. I totally agree. And, what I tell people is that, look, social media, it's a new ecosystem that we interact in. It's a new environment, and environments aren't good or bad, right? It depends on how you engage with the environment that determines the implications it has for your emotional life. And I think if you look at the evidence, you find evidence to support that idea as well. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Let's move towards a conclusion. You've got a book coming out soon. Would you like to tell us a bit about that book?
Yes, the book coming out, it's called Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters and How to Harness It. And it's coming out next January. And it talks about a lot of the work that we've talked about on this podcast, but goes deeper, namely, why is it that our ability to think about our lives sometimes can be an incredible superpower, but at other times tank our mood and our relationships? And importantly, what are the tools that we possess to master that ability to introspect?
That sounds amazing. Available for pre-order or soon?
It's available for pre-order. It's on Amazon and all of, it's on Amazon. I don't know about all the other sites yet because I'm a first-time author, but I know you can find it on Amazon. And pre-order is available.
Well, congratulations. Chatter. I love the sound of that. It sounds brilliant. To wrap up the podcast, I always ask 5 questions of all of my guests. Everyone gets the same ones, and they're supposed to be reasonably rapid fire. But if you want to expand on any, sometimes we hear some of our most compelling and delightful stories. So question number 1, Ethan Kross, if we asked your 2 daughters what their favorite thing to do with you is, what would they tell us?
Pickle time before bed, cooking dinner together, and traveling to exciting places, which don't mean exotic, but exciting.
Beautiful. What's been your trickiest parenting moment? And don't tell me that it was that marshmallow experiment where your daughter wanted bonuses.
No, my trickiest moment has been seeing my children deal with emotional hardship that the source of which is out of my control. So when other kids are being mean to them, and just knowing that inevitably there's going to be more of that in store for them as they live their lives, and just trying to help them as I experience their pain, which is not pleasant, but probably a good thing. So
yeah, it's interesting how many people will offer some kind of a response along those lines. Watching our children struggle seems to be an almost universally agreed upon challenge that no parent wants, and yet every parent knows how important that is. It seems to teach them everything that they need to know about being a great human ongoingly. Question number 3, Ethan, if you could spend an hour with your 2 daughters at any age at all, so tomorrow afternoon they walk in the door and they're waiting for you in the living room at that age, what age would you pick and why?
I would take their current age, and the reason for that is I found every age to be equally awe-inspiring and fun. And I'm sure that'll continue. So their current age.
No matter how wonderful their current age is and how glad you are to be in the moment, what are you looking forward to most as a dad?
Seeing them succeed at whatever they choose to devote themselves to, seeing them make a mark on the world in some way. Seeing my oldest daughter, she recently did community theater, and it was important to her, and I've never done any kind of theater, but seeing her get up on the stage and sing and dance, it was just remarkable to see how she had achieved what was important for her. And so just watching them both pursue their goals and hopefully accomplish them, and if not, learning from them and finding new ones is something I look forward to.
Brilliant. And the last question, if you could go back to Ethan Kross as a very young dad, having one of those terribly tough moments with no experience at all as a parenting expert, and maybe even without the PhD in self-control and psychology, what advice would you give yourself?
I would to be less hard on myself and to likewise remember that incredible mental time travel machine that we all possess. I think when my kids were young and parenting was new to me, you can get carried away with what's happening and not knowing when will the sleepless nights end and so forth. And so just knowing that things will get better as time goes on would have been powerful to have a reminder of back then.
Well, Ethan, it's just been an absolute pleasure to talk with you. So grateful for your generous sharing and your wisdom. Thank you for being a part of the Parenting in Perspective podcast.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What a fun conversation. So I hope we can do it again.
Wow, what a fascinating discussion. I hope you've gotten some insight into Professor Ethan Kross as a result of this podcast. As I said at the beginning of the podcast, I just love the fact that he's linked to this all-time classic marshmallow experiment and the work of Walter Mischel, one of the most important psychologists of the modern era. Just a quick reminder as well, I can't emphasize this enough, and Ethan also made the point, if you're going to try that experiment on your own children, their destiny is not linked directly to the decision that they make about the marshmallow. What we want to do is make sure that they learn how to self-control better, because the more self-control they have in healthy doses, the better it will be in their lives. Okay, if you're enjoying the podcast and you reckon it's worth sharing with other people, could you help out and leave us that 5-star review and a comment? Please, the comments and the reviews and the 5-star ratings, they help other people to find out about the podcast and find ways that they can be more informed and make their families happier and more flourishing. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. More information and more resources to make your family happier are available at happyfamilies.com.au.